Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Tonight we're diving into something a little chillier than usual, the frigid reality of medieval winter nights and how peasants somehow managed to survive them. But before we get too comfortable under our modern blankets, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you find my voice soothing enough to drift off to. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. I'm always curious about who's joining our little historical slumber party from around the world. Now, dim your lights if you haven't already. Maybe grab an extra blanket. You'll appreciate it after hearing what's coming. And let's ease into tonight's journey through the coldest, darkest nights of medieval Europe. Imagine for a moment you've just opened your eyes in a small village somewhere in England, circa 1328. It's mid-January and the darkness outside your window is absolute. No streetlights, no gentle glow from neighbours' windows, and just pure unrelenting darkness, occasionally broken by moonlight when the clouds part. The first thing you notice isn't the darkness though, it's the cold. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but seems to seep directly into your bones. You're lying on a straw mattress that's seen better days. Much, much better days. The straw hasn't been changed since last harvest, and it's compacted into lumpy ridges that dig into your back. Your blanket, as if you can call it that, is a rough woolen cloth that's simultaneously too heavy and not warm enough. It scratches against your skin like sandpaper, but removing it would mean surrendering to the bitter cold that's turned your breath into little clouds hovering above your face. The fire that kept your one-room home somewhat bearable has died down to embers hours ago. No one stays up all night to tend it. Firewood is precious, and you've rationed it carefully to last through winter. Besides, sleep is the only escape from the monotony and hardship of medieval winter. Even if that sleep is restless and interrupted by shivers. You're not alone in this room, of course. Medieval privacy wasn't exactly a concept anyone understood. Your entire family, parents, siblings, maybe grandparents, possibly even livestock, all share this single room. In fact, on the coldest nights, bringing the animals inside was essential. Your cow, a few chickens, maybe a goat or two, they've all been invited in for the night. Not out of kindness, mind you, but because their body heat might just keep everyone from freezing. They're nature's very own, very smelly space heaters. Oh, and that smell? It's a complex bouquet of unwashed bodies, animal dung, smoke from the fire, and the musty odour of damp straw. But honestly, you barely notice it anymore. This is just how winter smells. This is just how life smells. You shift position, trying to find a spot where the straw doesn't poke quite so sharply, where the draught from the door doesn't hit quite so directly. Your feet touch someone else's, probably your younger brother's, and you're secretly grateful for the shared warmth, even if his toes are as cold as ice. Outside, the wind howls through the village, finding every crack and crevice in your humble dwelling. Your home isn't exactly airtight. The walls, made of wattle and daub, a mixture of twigs, mud and animal dung, have seen better days. Little cracks have formed where the material has dried and separated, and though you've tried to patch them, new ones appear with every freeze and thaw cycle. The roof, a thick layer of thatch, does its best to keep out the elements, but it's no match for the determined winter wind. Occasionally, a light dusting of snow finds its way through, settling on your blanket or, if you're particularly unlucky, on your face. Sleep comes in fits and starts. You doze off, only to be awakened by a particularly strong gust of wind, or by your body's own violent shivering. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep, especially not in winter. Instead, they practiced something historians now call segmented sleep, sleeping in 2 or more phases throughout the night. So you might wake up in what we'd now call the middle of the night, stay awake for an hour or so, perhaps stoking the fire if any wood remains, checking on the smallest children or the elderly, maybe even having a quiet conversation with whoever else is awake, before drifting back to sleep until dawn. Speaking of dawn, it comes late in winter, and you're usually awake before it, not because you want to be, but because the cold is intensified with the pre-dawn chill, making sleep impossible. Your joints ache, your fingers and toes feel numb, your nose is running, and you're fighting back the urge to cough. Winter illnesses were feared for good reason in an age without antibiotics or effective medicine. But it's not just the physical discomfort that makes winter nights so challenging. It's the psychological weight of the darkness. We modern humans, with our light, polluted skies and 24/7 access to artificial illumination, can hardly imagine the profound darkness of a medieval winter night. It was darkness so complete it seemed alive, darkness that swallowed villages whole, darkness that made the world beyond your door seem like an abyss. And in that darkness the medieval mind found plenty to fear. Wolves prowling the village outskirts, spirits wandering the night, the ever-present fear that the cold might take the very young or very old before morning. Winter nights weren't just uncomfortable, they were genuinely dangerous. So how did medieval peasants cope with these brutal conditions? How did they actually survive the coldest nights when the temperature plummeted and staying warm seemed impossible? Let's start with their sleeping arrangements. While a straw mattress doesn't sound particularly comfortable to us, it actually offered decent insulation from the cold ground below. The straw trapped pockets of air, creating a buffer between the sleeper and the frozen earth. Many peasant homes had sleeping platforms slightly raised off the ground, which helped even more. Communal sleeping wasn't just a space-saving measure, it was a survival strategy. A typical peasant family would all sleep together, often in one large bed if they had one, or on shared pallets on the floor. Body heat was precious, and sleeping in close proximity meant sharing it. Children would often sleep between adults for extra warmth, and as I mentioned earlier, on particularly cold nights, animals might join the arrangement. Clothing played a crucial role too. Unlike us, medieval peasants didn't change into special sleepwear. They simply slept in their clothes, perhaps removing the outer layer if they had one. In winter, they might wear every garment they owned to bed. Woolen socks if they had them, hats or hoods to keep the head warm, layers upon layers of whatever they had. The materials were key. Wool was the most common fabric, and despite being scratchy and uncomfortable, it had excellent insulating properties, even when damp. Linen was used for undergarments by those who could afford it, providing a layer of protection against wool's itch. Furs, for the very lucky or somewhat prosperous, offered superior warmth, but were beyond the reach of most common peasants. The fire was, of course, central to survival. Most peasant homes were built around a central hearth, not a proper fireplace with a chimney, mind you, but an open fire pit in the middle of the room. The smoke would rise and ideally find its way out through a hole in the roof, though much of it lingered in the upper part of the room, creating a smoky haze that stung the eyes, but crucially helped insulate the space. Firewood was a precious commodity, carefully gathered and rationed. Oak and beech burned longest, but peasants couldn't be picky. They burned whatever they could find, including twisted branches, roots, and even dried animal dung when wood was scarce. The fire would be carefully banked before sleep, covered with ashes to keep the embers alive until morning, without consuming too much fuel. Some regions had communal heating solutions. In parts of northern Europe, for example, communities built what were essentially primitive hypercore systems, channeling hot air from a central fire under raised platforms where people slept. In Russia and other extremely cold regions, massive clay ovens dominated peasant homes, and family members would actually sleep on top of these ovens during the coldest nights. But what about when these measures weren't enough? When the cold was so severe that no amount of bundling or fire tending seemed to help? Medieval peasants had a few last resorts. One was alcohol. A drink of ale, or, in Eastern Europe, vodka before bed would create a sensation of warmth by dilating blood vessels near the skin. It didn't actually raise body temperature. In fact, it ultimately lowered it. But the temporary feeling of warmth might help someone fall asleep. It was a dangerous strategy, though. Too much alcohol before sleep in freezing conditions could be fatal. Hot stones were another approach. Rocks placed near the fire during the evening would absorb heat. Wrapped in cloth, these hot stones could then be placed at the foot of the bed, or held against the chest while falling asleep. The heat would gradually dissipate, but it might last long enough to drift off. But perhaps the most important strategy was simply acceptance. Medieval peasants had a relationship with cold that we modern humans have lost. They expected it. They endured it. They knew winter wasn't a season to be conquered, but to be survived. Their bodies acclimated to cold in ways ours don't, and their expectations were fundamentally different. They didn't expect to be comfortable. They expected to be alive come morning, and that's an important point. Because medieval winter wasn't just about the cold itself. It was about scarcity. It was about hunger that gnawed at the belly and made the cold feel even more biting. It was about the constant fear that the food stores might run out before spring brought new growth. Most peasants entered winter with their bodies already preparing for hardship. The fall harvest might bring temporary abundance, but by January rations were tight. The daily diet shrunk to the essentials. Dark bread, perhaps softened in ale to make it more palatable. Pottage, a thick soup of whatever vegetables remained in storage, and very occasionally preserved meat or fish for the lucky ones. This diet was barely sufficient in calories, particularly given the physical demands of medieval labour. The body, desperate for energy to maintain its core temperature, would burn through these limited calories quickly. Many peasants existed in a state of semi-starvation through the winter months, making them even more vulnerable to the cold. Sleep, in this context, became not just a physical necessity, but a survival strategy. Sleeping meant reducing energy expenditure. It meant escaping, however briefly, the constant discomfort of cold and hunger. It meant passing the darkest hours in unconsciousness rather than anxious wakefulness. But sleep itself was a complicated affair in medieval times, regardless of season. Let me tell you a little more about how our ancestors approached this essential human function so differently than we do today. Medieval sleep patterns were, as I mentioned earlier, quite different from our modern expectation of a single uninterrupted 8-hour stretch. Historical evidence suggests that pre-industrial societies commonly practiced biphasic or segmented sleep. They would sleep for approximately 4 hours, then wake for 1 to 2 hours, before sleeping for another 4 hours. This midnight waking wasn't considered insomnia or a sleep disorder. It was normal and expected. During this wakeful period, medieval peasants might tend to the fire, check on children or elderly family members, perhaps even visit neighbours, though less likely in the depths of winter. Some would pray, others would talk quietly with family members who were also awake, and many would simply lie in the darkness thinking or meditating. Interestingly, this period of wakefulness was often considered a special, almost sacred time. The quiet, the darkness, the separation from daily labour. It created a space for contemplation that busy daylight hours didn't allow. Some historians believe this midnight waking may have been essential for medieval people's psychological well-being, providing a buffer between dreams and a time for processing the day's events. The transition back to sleep would typically happen naturally as the body's temperature dropped again. By the time dawn approached, late in winter mornings, most would be in their second sleep phase, only to be awakened by the increasing light, the stirring of animals, or simply the body's natural rhythm. But what about those who couldn't sleep at all? Those nights when the cold was so severe, the hunger so intense, or illness so uncomfortable that sleep remained elusive. Medieval peasants had various folk remedies and sleep aids, though their effectiveness was certainly questionable by modern standards. Herbal remedies were common. Chamomile, valerian root, and lavender were known for their calming properties, and those with access to these plants might brew teas, or stuff small pouches to be placed near the pillow. Hops, now known primarily as an ingredient in beer, were also used as a sedative, sometimes stuffed into pillows. Prayer was perhaps the most universal sleep aid. In a deeply religious society, invoking divine protection before sleep was standard practice. Many would recite specific prayers believed to ward off nightmares or ensure peaceful rest. The psychological comfort of entrusting oneself to divine care shouldn't be underestimated. It likely helped many find sleep despite challenging conditions. Some beliefs about sleep verged on what we might now call superstition. Placing an iron knife under the bed was thought to keep evil spirits at bay. Sleeping with one's head pointed north was considered healthful in some regions. Various chants, rituals, and protective symbols were employed to ensure safe passage through the vulnerable state of sleep. For children, whose sleep was considered particularly vulnerable to disturbance by supernatural forces, special protective measures might be taken. Baptized children were thought to be under divine protection, but additional safeguards like crosses drawn on foreheads with ash or special prayers spoken over cradles were common. Comfort measures were limited but not entirely absent. Those suffering from coughs or chest ailments might sleep in a more upright position, supported by bundles of straw or, for the slightly better off, crude pillows filled with straw, wool, or even feathers for the relatively prosperous. For joint pain, a constant companion of peasants who performed hard physical labour in damp conditions, various poultices and rubs might be applied before sleep. Mustard plasters, garlic, and various herb mixtures were common treatments, their strong smells adding to the already complex olfactory environment of the medieval home. But let's be honest, despite all these measures, winter sleep for medieval peasants was rarely what we would consider restful. It was a nightly battle against the elements, a temporary escape from discomfort rather than a peaceful repose. The morning would come, with stiff joints, backs aching from the uneven sleeping surface, and the psychological weight of knowing another day of winter hardship awaited. Yet somehow they endured. Generation after generation survived these brutal winters, their bodies and minds adapting to conditions we would consider unbearable. Perhaps there's something to be learned from their resilience, their acceptance of seasonal hardship as part of the natural rhythm of life. In our modern world of temperature-controlled environments, memory foam mattresses and blackout curtains, we've lost something of our ancestors' connection to the natural cycles of heat and cold, light and dark. We've gained comfort, certainly, but perhaps lost something of their hardiness, their ability to find rest despite discomfort. Now let's shift our focus slightly, because while the physical challenges of medieval winter nights were daunting, the psychological and social dimensions were equally significant. How did peasants maintain morale during these dark, cold months? How did communities support each other when resources were scarce and conditions harsh? Winter evenings, before sleep, often saw families gathered close to the fire. Not just for warmth, but for connection. These hours were precious opportunities for cultural transmission. Elder family members would tell stories, folk tales, family histories, religious narratives that served multiple purposes. They entertained, certainly, but they also educated, preserved cultural identity, and often contained practical wisdom disguised as fantastic tales. Many of these stories explicitly addressed the fears that loomed large in winter darkness. Tales of heroes overcoming cold, hunger, and supernatural threats provided psychological comfort, especially to children. They reinforced the message that winter, however harsh, was survivable, that spring would eventually return. Music played a role too. Simple instruments, pipes, drums, stringed instruments made from whatever materials were available, might be played in the evening. Songs were sung, often work songs, or religious hymns that reinforced community bonds and cultural identity. Even in the depths of winter, when food was scarce and cold was biting, these cultural practices provided essential nourishment for the spirit. Community bonds were particularly vital during winter. Medieval villages functioned as interdependent systems, with mutual aid being not just a moral ideal, but a practical necessity for survival. Checking on elderly neighbours, sharing firewood, or food in desperate circumstances, collectively clearing snow from essential pathways, these communal efforts made the difference between life and death for many. Religious observances provided both spiritual comfort and community cohesion during winter. The Christian calendar placed Christmas, a celebration of light and divine presence, strategically in the darkest part of the year. While medieval Christmas bore little resemblance to a modern commercial holiday, it provided an important psychological boost during the hardest season. Other winter religious festivals served similar purposes. St. Lucy's Day, celebrated on December 13th, which, under the Julian calendar, was the winter solstice, was a festival of light in Scandinavian countries. Candlemas in early February marked the midpoint of winter and was associated with weather prediction, similar to our Groundhog Day. These observances created psychological milestones through the long winter, helping peasants measure their progress towards spring. Winter also altered the typical gender divisions of labour in peasant households. While men typically worked the fields during growing seasons, winter confined much agricultural work to indoor spaces, bringing family members together for shared tasks. Women might spin wool or flax, men might repair tools or craft wooden implements, children might assist with both, all working in the same space, conserving heat and light resources. This enforced togetherness had both positive and negative aspects. On one hand, it strengthened family bonds and allowed for the transmission of skills across generations. On the other, the lack of privacy and the stress of scarcity could exacerbate tensions. Medieval court records show an increase in interpersonal conflicts during winter months, suggesting that the strain of confinement took its toll. Sleep would have been an escape from these tensions, a few hours of respite from the constant negotiations required by close-quarter living, but it was also vulnerable time. A family member who fell ill during sleep might not be noticed until morning. A fire left unattended might die out completely, leaving the home dangerously cold by dawn. An ember might escape the hearth, posing a fire risk to the entire dwelling. These concerns meant that even sleep was in some sense a communal affair. Family members would take turns being the last to fall asleep and the first to wake, ensuring that these transition periods were covered. In larger households, informal night watches might be established, with different members responsible for checking the fire at different points through the night. For the elderly and the very young, winter sleep posed particular challenges. The very old, with failing circulation and often chronic pain, would feel the cold most acutely. They would usually be given sleeping spots closest to the fire, sometimes with extra coverings if available. Still, winter took a heavy toll on the elderly population, with mortality rates spiking during and immediately after the coldest months. Infants and young children, with their smaller bodies and less developed temperature regulation, were also extremely vulnerable. They would typically sleep nestled between parents or older siblings, benefiting from shared body heat. Cradles, for those families that had them, might be placed near the fire, though not so close as to risk sparks or excessive heat. Special care was taken with new mothers and newborns during winter. The postpartum period was recognised as particularly dangerous, and communities would rally to support new mothers with additional food, fuel, and practical assistance. A new baby born in winter would be swaddled tightly in whatever soft fabrics were available, often with a small cap to prevent heat loss through the head. But despite all these precautions and community supports, winter claimed many victims. The historical record shows consistent spikes in mortality during the hunger months of late winter and early spring, when food stores ran low and bodies weakened by months of cold and limited nutrition finally succumbed to disease or simply gave out from exhaustion. The psychological impact of these losses would have been profound, yet medieval peasants approached death with a familiarity that modern people might find difficult to understand. Death was not hidden away in hospitals or funeral homes, but was an intimate domestic experience. Bodies would be prepared for burial by family members, often lying in the same one-room home where everyone ate and slept until burial arrangements could be made. This intimacy with death likely shaped how medieval people approached sleep itself. Sleep and death were linguistically and conceptually linked in medieval thought. Sleep was sometimes called little death, and the dead were described as sleeping until resurrection. This connection wasn't merely poetic, it reflected a worldview in which the boundaries between different states of being were more fluid than in our modern secular understanding. Perhaps this is why prayer before sleep was so universal and so important. Commending one's soul to divine protection before entering this vulnerable state was not just a formality, but a genuine spiritual necessity. Many modern prayer traditions preserve echoes of this approach. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Though few modern people recite such words with the same literal understanding of their medieval ancestors, the medieval approach to winter sleep, then, was not simply a collection of physical survival strategies, but a complex negotiation between bodily needs, social structures, and spiritual beliefs. Sleep was never purely individual. It was embedded in the web of family and community relationships that sustained life through the harshest conditions. As dawn finally broke on a winter morning, peasants would emerge from their night's rest with no expectation of comfort or ease in the day ahead. Their sleep had not been what we would consider restorative, but it had been sufficient, enough to maintain life, enough to face another day of winter's challenges. The fire would be carefully rekindled from the night's embers, precious fuel added gradually to build the day's warmth. Bodies stiff from cold would move slowly at first, performing necessary tasks with the deliberate care of those conserving energy. A simple breakfast, perhaps leftover bread soaked in ale, maybe porridge if grain supplies allowed, would provide just enough calories to begin the day's work. And what work there was. Even in winter's grip, while the fields might lie dormant under snow or frost, medieval peasants couldn't afford true hibernation. Wood needed to be gathered and processed. Animals required care and feeding. Repairs to tools and structures, postponed during busy harvest seasons, would occupy the daylight hours. Women would spin, weave and sew. Men would work leather, wood, and occasionally metal for household implements. All this activity served multiple purposes beyond the obvious practical ones. Physical movement generated body heat, essential for survival in cold conditions. Productive work provided psychological benefits, giving purpose and structure to days that might otherwise stretch endlessly in winter darkness. And shared labour reinforced the social bonds that were essential for community survival. By the time evening approached again, bodies tired from work would welcome the prospect of rest, imperfect though it might be. The cycle would begin anew. The fire banking, the family gathering close, the protective prayers, the gradual surrender to sleep despite discomfort, and so they endured, night after night, through winters that must have seemed interminable. They found sleep where they could, huddled together for warmth, comforted by familiar presences in the darkness, sustained by the simple faith that spring would eventually return. What can we learn from these medieval sleepers, our ancestors who knew cold and darkness in ways we can barely imagine? Perhaps there's wisdom in their acceptance of seasonal hardship, their understanding that comfort is fleeting, but community endures. Perhaps there's something to be gained from reconnecting with the natural rhythms they couldn't escape. The genuine darkness of night, the true quiet of a world without mechanical noise, or perhaps the greatest lesson is simply appreciation for the warmth we take for granted, for the soft beds we sleep in without a second thought, for the security of knowing that tomorrow will likely bring enough food and continued shelter. These simple comforts, so basic to our modern existence, would have seemed like unimaginable luxury to the medieval peasant drifting into uneasy sleep on a winter's night. As you lie in your comfortable bed, perhaps already drifting towards sleep as my voice continues, take a moment to feel the softness beneath you, the perfect weight of your blanket, the precisely controlled temperature of your room. These are not small things. These are profound luxuries earned through centuries of human innovation and social development. And yet, there might be something we've lost along the way. The medieval peasant, for all their hardship, fell asleep under a sky blazing with stars on clear nights. They knew the subtle changes in air and light that signalled winter's gradual retreat. They experienced the profound relief of spring's arrival with an intensity we can barely comprehend. Their sleep, uncomfortable by our standards, was nonetheless embedded in natural cycles and human connections that gave it meaning beyond mere physical rest. Perhaps, as we ease into our ergonomic mattresses and set our alarm clocks, we might consider what elements of their sleep wisdom we might reclaim, even in our vastly different world. But now, let's leave our medieval ancestors to their winter slumber and move on to explore another aspect of their lives that might surprise us, because their days were filled with challenges, just as significant as their nights, and the strategies they developed to confront those challenges speak to an ingenuity and resilience that deserves our respect. Medieval peasant clothing might not have been fashionable by any stretch of the imagination, but it was remarkably functional, given the available materials and technology. Far from the colourful, flowing garments depicted in Hollywood movies, real peasant attire was simple, durable, and designed for work rather than appearance. The foundation of a peasant's wardrobe was the undertunic or shirt, typically made of linen for those who could afford it, or a coarser hemp fabric for the poorer folk. This garment was worn next to the skin and served as both undergarment and nightwear. Medieval peasants didn't change clothes for sleeping as we do today. During the coldest months, they would simply sleep in their day clothes, perhaps removing the outer layers if they had multiple garments. Over this basic shirt came the woolen tunic or kirtle, the primary garment for both men and women, though cut differently for each. Men's tunics typically reached to the knee, while women's extended to the ankle. These weren't the finely woven wool textiles we might imagine today, but rather coarse, heavy fabrics that prioritised warmth and durability over comfort. The wool was often undyed, resulting in garments of natural grey, brown or off-white colours. Sleeves were an important consideration in medieval clothing. Tight sleeves restricted movement for work, while overly loose ones could catch on tools or branches. The practical solution was often sleeves that were somewhat fitted at the upper arm but wider at the wrist, allowing for freedom of movement without excess fabric getting in the way. Legwear for men consisted of brays, a type of loose linen drawers covered by woolen hose, or chausses that were either tied to the brays or to a belt around the waist. Women typically wore only shifts under their kirtles, with extra layers added in winter as available. Footwear, when available, was simple leather shoes or boots, often without proper soles. Many peasants went barefoot during warmer months to save their precious shoes for winter. In particularly cold regions, straw might be stuffed into shoes for additional insulation, uncomfortable but effective at trapping warmth. The medieval peasant's winter gear wasn't particularly specialised by modern standards. A cloak, usually made of heavy wool and sometimes lined with fur, if the peasant was relatively prosperous, served as the primary protection against wind and cold. These cloaks were versatile garments, serving as blankets or ground covers when needed, and could be adjusted to allow for work while keeping most of the body covered. Hoods were essential winter wear, protecting the head and neck from biting winds. These weren't attached to garments as in the modern hoodies, but were separate pieces that could be worn over tunics or under cloaks as needed. They often extended to cover part of the shoulders and upper chest, providing extra warmth to these vulnerable areas. Mittens or gloves were rare luxuries for most peasants. Instead, they might wrap cloth around their hands or tuck them into their sleeves or pockets sewn into their garments. During work, keeping hands warm was a constant challenge, solved primarily through movement rather than specialised clothing. But perhaps the most significant winter garment innovation was layering. Medieval peasants understood the principle of trapping air between layers of clothing to create insulation. They would wear multiple tunics, stuff straw or moss between layers for added warmth, and generally pile on whatever was available when temperatures dropped. The critical difference between medieval winter clothing and our modern approach was maintenance. We expect to wash our clothes regularly, but medieval peasants had few options for laundering, especially in winter when drying. Clothes outdoors was difficult or impossible. Instead, clothing was worn for extended periods, accumulating body oils that actually provided some water resistance and additional insulation, though at the cost of hygiene by modern standards. Speaking of hygiene, let's address the elephant in the room. Medieval peasants didn't bathe frequently, particularly in winter. The combination of cold, limited water heating capacity, and genuine fear about the health impacts of bathing in cold weather meant that full body washing was rare during winter months. Instead, they might wash hands and faces occasionally, but otherwise relied on the dry cold to minimise body odour, one small benefit of winter living. The result of these clothing and hygiene practices was that medieval peasants essentially developed a second skin of fabrics and bodily secretions that, while undoubtedly malodorous by our standards, served as surprisingly effective environmental protection. Their bodies acclimated to consistent cold exposure in ways that our climate-controlled existences have not allowed modern humans to experience. This acclimation meant that medieval peasants likely experienced cold differently than we would. Temperatures that would send us rushing for emergency blankets and heaters were simply normal winter conditions for them. Their bodies adapted, Their expectations adjusted, and they developed a resilience to cold that most modern humans would find difficult to imagine. But we shouldn't romanticize this hardiness. Cold exposure took a significant toll on medieval bodies. Chilblains, painful inflammation of small blood vessels in response to cold, were common winter ailments, particularly affecting fingers, toes, ears, and other extremities. Frostbite was a genuine risk in severe conditions, potentially leading to loss of digits or even limbs in extreme cases. Arthritis and rheumatism plagued many peasants, exacerbated by cold, damp conditions and hard physical labour. These chronic conditions made winter particularly challenging, as stiff, painful joints had to continue working despite the cold. Various herbal remedies and poultices were applied to ease these symptoms, with varying degrees of effectiveness. Respiratory issues were perhaps the most dangerous winter health challenge. The combination of cold air, indoor smoke from fires, and close contact in confined spaces created perfect conditions for the spread of respiratory infections. Without modern antibiotics, what might have been minor colds or cases of bronchitis for us could develop into life-threatening pneumonia for medieval peasants. The very young and the elderly were particularly vulnerable to these winter hazards. Mortality rates for both demographics spiked during and immediately after winter, a pattern that persisted well into the early modern period. Communities recognised this vulnerability and often developed support systems for these at-risk members, though resources were always limited. Yet, despite these challenges, medieval peasants not only survived winter after winter, but managed to maintain functional communities and productive agricultural systems. Their resilience wasn't just physical but psychological and social. They understood that survival depended on cooperation, careful resource management, and maintaining morale through the darkest months. Winter evenings were not merely endured but utilised. While daylight hours were precious and devoted primarily to essential tasks, the long nights provided opportunities for activities that maintained both practical skills and community bonds. Women would spin and weave by firelight, men would carve wood or repair tools, and children would learn these skills through observation and gradual participation. Storytelling, as mentioned earlier, was more than entertainment. It was cultural transmission and psychological support. The tales told around winter fires often emphasised themes of endurance, cleverness overcoming hardship, and the eventual triumph of spring over winter's grip. These narratives reinforced the mental resilience necessary to weather the difficult season. Music served a similar function. Simple instruments, pipes, drums, stringed instruments made from available materials provided accompaniment for songs that preserved cultural identity and often explicitly addressed the challenges of seasonal hardship. Music created a sense of communal experience and emotional release that helped maintain psychological health during stressful times. Games and simple entertainments helped pass the long dark hours. Chess and various forms of board games were known even in peasant communities, though pieces might be crudely made from available materials rather than the elaborate sets used by nobility. Dice games, though often frowned upon by church authorities for their association with gambling, were nevertheless popular across all social classes. These social and cultural practices weren't luxuries, but essential components of winter survival. They maintained community cohesion, preserved essential knowledge, and provided psychological support during the most challenging season. The medieval peasant understood that surviving winter required addressing needs beyond the merely physical. The mind and spirit required nourishment as well. Religious observances provided structure and meaning to the winter months. The liturgical calendar placed significant celebrations during winter. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany, Candlemas, creating milestones that helped break the psychological monotony of the season. These festivals, while religious in nature, also served very practical functions in maintaining community bonds and providing occasions for shared meals and celebrations, even when resources were scarce. For instance, Christmas in medieval villages was less about gift-giving and more about communal feasting and religious observance. Even in the leanest years, communities would attempt to prepare special foods for this celebration, often preserving choice items from autumn harvests specifically for this purpose. The psychological boost of shared celebration and slightly more abundant food, even if just for a day, should not be underestimated. The church also provided physical shelter during the coldest days. Stone churches, while not heated in the modern sense, were often more substantial than peasant homes and could retain heat from bodies gathered for services. Extended liturgical celebrations during winter festivals meant more time spent in these communal spaces, providing respite from domestic cold and reinforcing social bonds. But perhaps the most important psychological resource for medieval winter survival was the absolute certainty that spring would return. This wasn't just a matter of faith, but of experienced reality passed down through generations. Every elder in the community had witnessed winter's retreat many times over, and this collective memory provided essential reassurance during the darkest, down not just their genes but their resilience, a heritage that remains within us, even as we sleep in warmth and comfort they could scarcely imagine. Sleep well, knowing that the lessons of history surround us, even in our dreams, and join me next time on Boring History for Sleep, when we'll explore another fascinating chapter from our shared past. Good night.